which won an Oscar. And he's
In fact, I provide.
said that Opals is about to contact me just to write something. He wants to be in this.
Interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting. Maybe, yeah, I mean, I'm wondering, because he's not going to teach, you know, he's not going to teach. He's going to be like a resource and do a big event or a class or something, right? And do something like show his work, which I would love. Maybe it makes sense to do
primarily my training meeting
with the two.
So I
think
have
the middle school would love it too. Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
So we look at like
Yeah.
This is my burning section.
Well, ask him before they go punchline. Ask him inside in the garage or something up to your back.
I'm going to be stealing this idea anyway. Well, nice to meet you.
So,
Great, and then I'll come back.
and
Do you want me this one or this one?
should have, I don't care. I should have mentioned that they're taping this and it
Yeah.
will be shown on Columbia's website, CJR's website, Internal School's website.
They're streaming it, but I'm sure nobody's watching it because no one does. But
They show it not now, but they show it over the next
oh,
month.
okay, all right.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And it's a great honor this evening that we have with us Jacob Weisberg, who is has spoken at the Delacorte Lectures before, and it's always a pleasure to hear him here. I'm Victor Navasky, for those of you I don't know. Jacob is the editor of the Slate Group, the editor-in-chief, and the chairman. He started out in Slate as the editor many years ago in 1996. He served as the editor for 6 years. He now runs the whole show. He's written for virtually every magazine in print that you care about, that you've read. He's been a contributor to the New Republic. He's been a contributing editor at the New York Times Magazine. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair magazine, columnist for Newsweek, the Financial Times, etc. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and he's written a number of books, including books on Bushisms. He's written a book called The Bush Tragedy, which was a bestseller. My favorite story about him, which I hadn't known before, but in reading up on him for this evening, I discovered that he was invited to join Yale's famous Skull and Bones Society by none other than John Kerry, and turned him down because they didn't accept women in those years. So I don't know.
That's true. That's
That's
true.
very
Now they
good.
do.
It's
Nobody
an
cares.
honor. But nevertheless, he became a Rhodes Scholar despite that anti-academic decision. So it's an honor for us to have you here, Jacob. And why don't you tell us what's on your mind, and then you'll have questions from everybody. Okay?
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, Victor. I went up to Victor's office beforehand, and I became mildly panicked when he said they had made this lecture no longer compulsory. But then he said, don't worry, they've added free food, so people still might come. I've given the Delacorte at Victor's invitation several times before, and the truth is, in past years, I've usually winged it because as someone who'd been practicing digital journalism for a long time, there was a pretty big gap between what I knew and what students and faculty here knew, and I could get a pretty big rise out of everybody just by saying some stuff that seemed fairly familiar and obvious to me. But I really think that gap has shrunk. I think there's sort of, the world has caught up to us. Journalism school has definitely caught up to us. So I thought I should probably find a topic where I might actually know more than some people in the room. And what I want to talk about is something that I've really been focusing on for several years now, which is the emerging business around digital journalism. And it's a subject that I think journalism students really need to be thinking about. I don't know if it's part of the curriculum here in any way. I suspect not for the most part. But you know, a decade ago or longer, it was fine to be a journalist and not think about the business of journalism at all. You just left the sort of financial stuff to the publishing side and did your thing, and that was sort of how it was supposed to be. But I think now, to be a successful journalist, you have to think like an entrepreneur in a lot of ways. You have to think about building your own audience. You have to think about your relationship with your audience personally. And you have to think about what kind of institution can support the journalism that you want to do, and that can do it with integrity and do it with staying power. None of those things are givens anymore in journalism. I thought maybe I'd get started by telling you a little bit about how I crossed over to the dark side, as we say. It was about 6 years ago I moved from a straight editorial role to a kind of hybrid business editorial role. And I did it for a few reasons. One was I had a great deputy, David Plotz, who's now the editor of Slate. And I thought it was time for him to have a chance. I'm a believer in term limits for editors and columnists. I think after a certain period of time, however many years it is, it varies from person to person and place to place, but you've sort of done what you're going to do to remake a publication, to change it, to give it your imprint, and it's just more interesting if instead of hanging on indefinitely, you give someone else a chance. So that was part of it. But I also changed my role because the problem we were facing at Slate, the big problem, was not on the editorial side. You know, Slate was a fantastic publication. It had a really distinctive voice and style of journalism. We had a big dedicated audience. But we had a problem on the business side. We were still subsidized. We were still depending, first at Microsoft when I started to think about this, and then for our early years at the Washington Post. We weren't pulling our own weight, and I felt that it was just less secure as a long-term proposition than it needed to be. And I'd been, that challenge of figuring out how to make high-quality journalism work as a business was always core to what Slate was doing from the start. When we started in 1996, we had very little idea how we were going to make it work as a business, but we thought the internet could help because we wouldn't have all those fixed costs. And you know, we thought we would kind of figure something out and make it work, and I was still sort of committed to that challenge. You know, there was, I mean, I came from print magazines. I'd worked before that at the New Republic, at New York Magazine, various other places, and there was this pattern where the better magazines just perennially lost money, and they would go from, you know, owner to owner, but they were always subsidized. And Michael Kinsley, who was the founder of Slate, and I were never sort of satisfied with that arrangement. We thought there had to be a way that you could make good journalism work as a business to cover its costs. And the idea at Slate was you remove all of the big fixed costs in economic terms, that are around printing and distribution. And you know, you can just, the money that you put into it will really go into the content. You know, I think around 2008, which is when I made this change, just personally, I had this sort of the greatest sense of mission around trying to fix this broken model of journalism, which at that point, you know, everyone accepted was broken. Or if not fixing the model for lots of other bigger places, at least creating and then enlarging this space where you could do high quality journalism and make it work as a business. So, you know, in this period that I've been working in digital media, I've seen all these mood swings, I think you could fairly call them. Slate started as part or at the same time as a group of what were then called webzines. They had incredible names, Suck, Feed, and Salon is probably the one you're most likely to have heard of. Suck was actually really good. It was not what it sounds like. And that was the period when we had this kind of lonely thrill of being web pioneers. In those early days, Slate was really the first blogs anybody read. We did the first news aggregation in a feature we had called Today's Papers that summarized what was in the 5 big newspapers every day. I think we did the first slideshows. I'm not sure if we should be proud of that. A lot of the tone, the kind of more personal, more conversational tone of writing on the web really developed as much as anywhere else out of Slate. We also had one of the first, if not the first, paywall in 1998, which was the worst year at Slate because it cut off the growth of our audience. And in those days, people weren't even really pessimistic about digital media. They were just totally dismissive of it. They thought it was like a gimmick, a fad. Newspapers and magazines definitely didn't see it as a threat in any way. The old media, legacy media, actually really liked us. They were always kind of patting us on the head, and they were paid attention. They just didn't take us very seriously. And then the sort of mood swing after that was when financial markets became totally, irrationally exuberant about digital media. This was the period of the first tech bubble, which was like 1999, 2000, and huge. It's a little like now, to be honest. I mean, there were huge sums invested in projects that didn't work, good ideas, bad ideas. Everybody got funding. We were at Microsoft at the time. That's where we started Slate. They had 35 different magazines on the web. They're all gone except for Slate. But it was that time where it was just people were just pouring money. They thought, this is the future. We better get on board. But most of that did not survive the bursting of that bubble. And when we look back and ask why Slate did survive it, it was because we didn't have to go through the boom-bust cycle being at Microsoft, right? We had this big company. We had Bill Gates. We didn't have venture capitalists putting this pressure on us to get bigger, get bigger, get bigger until you explode. Michael Kinsley, who was my mentor in journalism, was always very allergic to any kind of magical thinking, which was a very useful corrective. I mean, I remember in that period people coming to us and saying, you could do an IPO, you could be spun off, you'd be worth $100 million. And Mike would just roll his eyes and not take it seriously. And it was also an advantage, to be honest, that the people who founded Slate didn't own Slate, right? We didn't really stand to benefit that much from doing an IPO, from cashing out. We were committed to a much longer-term project of building a sustainable business. If we hadn't had Bill Gates backing us, I think we would have been much more in the position that Salon was. Salon did an IPO, they raised $25 million in 1999, and actually had a stock market valuation, very briefly, of $100 million. And to justify those kinds of numbers, they had to grow much too fast, much faster than was good for that kind of publication. They had more than 140 people at one point, probably 1999, 2000. And then they collapsed and they had to lay just about everybody off. They've stayed afloat, but they've been kind of effectively bankrupt ever since. They were delisted by the stock exchange, and a few of the original investors have continued to put in enough money to keep them alive, but they've never really recovered from that experience. They've sort of been on life support. And after that bubble happened, everyone got much gloomier. They went careening all the way in the other direction. Digital media was never going to work. Digital advertising didn't work. The digital advertising market really bottomed out. I mean, it like fell off a cliff. Nobody believed in it. And then, then sort of the bad news kind of spread, right? I mean, newspapers started to experience their what were ultimately terminal difficulties for most of them. Magazines were in a lot of denial about it, said we're not like newspapers, and turns out they're a lot more like newspapers because of the change in how people are have wanted to consume content of all kinds. It was this funny sort of contradiction, right? If you're a consumer of news, everything was better. There'd never been a better time. You get everything you want. best news sources all over the world, read everything for free, almost all of it for free. But nothing was working as a business. The old legacy media properties were not working as businesses, and the new media properties, for the most part, were not working as businesses. You know, and this is when people were buying newspapers. They thought they'd gotten so cheap, and then they would buy them, and they would get cheaper, and they would try to find someone else to buy them. But then in the last couple of years, things have kind of come around again. And in some ways, the most heartening thing to me is that I think the top quality publications, all of which were in real jeopardy around the time of the financial crisis in 2008, have figured out ways to be viable, and in some cases, notably successful. And you know, you can make your own list of what you think the most important publications are, but in this country, take the New York Times, Washington Post, or I would include English language publications based in UK, the Financial Times, the Guardian, New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New Republic. Almost none of them had what looked like much of a future circa 2009. And I think just about all of those now have found business models that support their continued existence. And a key point is that all of these models involve multiple revenue streams, and they're all different. It's not one model. Everyone thought there would be a new model to replace the old model of newspapers. There aren't. There are lots of different models. So, you know, the New York Times has a very permeable paywall, right? I mean, the content is only a little bit restricted. The Financial Times has a very strict paywall. The content is highly restricted. You know, in some cases, you have a charitable trust, which the Guardian has, which provides an ongoing subsidy. In some cases, you have the New Republic, Washington Post. You have rich owners who are going to subsidize these things. You know, the Washington Post, for the first time in many years, hasn't had editorial newsroom budget cuts because Jeff Bezos hasn't figured out the business yet, but he's going to write some big checks until he does. The Republic was bought by Chris Hughes, who was one of the founders of Facebook. In fact, my favorite fact about him is that he had Facebook account number 2, which was actually the first account because he was Mark Zuckerberg's roommate. You know, the Atlantic works basically driven very much by a very successful events business. The New Yorker started to lose all this advertising. Luckily, they realized they were massively underpriced. They were kind of giving it away, sort of big magazine company, sending it out for less than the cost of delivery, like Cosmo, you know? And they said, wait a minute, what if we raise the price from, you know, $30 a year to $100 a year? My understanding is they've lost virtually no one. So they're now supported by their readers, by their audience, and the advertising has shrunk, but now they have another source of revenue that will keep them going. But if you look at these businesses, I mean, they're not businesses where a lot of people are expecting to get rich, and a lot of those businesses still have their old cost structures, but they've found survivable niches, you know, and they're all a little bit different. But you know, at the same time, what's been going on with new media properties is there's been this incredible boom and new enthusiasm. For years, the sort of tech investors, the venture capitalists, wanted nothing to do with content sites. It was like a dirty word. So Union Square Ventures is the most successful New York venture firm. They back Twitter and Tumblr, and they've made a number of good bets. They actually have a policy. I don't know if they're reviewing it now, but they were known for having a policy that they would not invest in any site that had to hire editors or writers. Like one writer, we won't invest in you. They only wanted platforms. That was sort of the name of the game. But now, you know, the venture world doesn't have this bias against content creation anymore. I think the breakthrough was about 3 years ago when Huffington Post was sold to AOL for $315 million. That was a number that got people's attention. But since then, BuzzFeed, Vox, Vice, Business Insider, Upworthy, these are all sites that have attracted venture investment of the kind that goes into straight technology. And other, you know, there have been stuff outside of that framework too, right? David Bradley, who owns The Atlantic, created these new properties, The Atlantic, Wire, and Quartz. I I was sure that after Tina Brown left, Barry Diller was going to shut down the Daily Beast. Instead, he's putting more money into it. He's also invested in the Atavist. There are all sorts of sites, including Gawker, that are doing a lot of aggressive international expansion. Jeff Bezos, before he bought the Post, had invested in Business Insider, and so on and so forth. Now, where does this sort of venture money go? Where are people excited about making a lot of money in digital media? It's going mainly to sites that can demonstrate, or at least convincingly project, this sort of exponential growth that the startup world likes. And it has to be sort of virally driven. There's some other examples. I mean, Medium is an interesting site. I'm sure a lot of you have seen. It's founded by a couple of the co-founders of Twitter. ESPN is backing Nate Silver's thing, 538, which used to be at the New York Times. Vox, which is another of these new media companies, is backing Ezra Klein's project, which they, in fact, decided to call Vox. There's also been this efflorescence of not-for-profit journalism, which I think is in some ways a lot more exciting to me. If you look at the categories of journalism that are realistically going to need some kind of subsidy, some of the biggest ones on the list are state and local public service reporting, kind of providing oversight on government and public officials. There's this thing called the Texas Tribune, which was founded by a former editor of the Texas Monthly. It's a great, great site, and they kind of think like a business, but they're not for profit, and they get support from philanthropies and organizations that will take on projects like that. Investigative reporting. There's no business around investigative reporting. Investigative reporting was always subsidized, but it was subsidized by newspapers that made a lot of money on other things. It didn't have to look too closely at what was bringing in the money and where the money was going out. But now there's ProPublica, which has similarly created this nonprofit model, partnering with other news organizations, but doing a lot of this journalism itself. There is Bill Keller, the former editor of the New York Times, is launching something called the Marshall Project, which is trying to do the same kind of thing around criminal justice reporting. Trying to put that higher on the agenda and devote resources to it, recognizing that you're probably not going to build a great business just around that. And I'd also put in that category what Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, is doing with First Look Media, the Glenn Greenwald thing. He's put $250 million into it. That's an insane amount of money. And I think their chances of succeeding with that would be about 10 times as high if they had 1/10 as much to work with. But nonetheless, it speaks to the willingness to put really meaningful resources behind not-for-profit journalism, whatever they actually call it. So I think we should think of this phenomenon as basically really good news. Marc Andreessen, who is the Silicon Valley's most influential venture capitalist, says that he thinks the news business will grow 10x to 100x over the next 20 years. I mean, that seems irrationally exuberant. On the other hand, if he's off by a factor of 5, that'll still be pretty great news. And journalism just isn't sort of seen as a charity case in the same way. People are running toward the business instead of running away from it, and that's probably true of some of you who were students in this room, right? I mean, 5 years ago, maybe a little more than that, journalism school was a real leap of faith. I think when Will Remus, who's sitting here, who works at Slate, made it, I'm not sure where you thought the return on that investment was going to be. You were kind of plunging into a profession that looked like a dead end. And in fact, J schools were not graduating people with really strong digital skills. And I think that's really changed now. Journalism school is, first of all, you're learning skills that are actually valuable to organizations that need them, which is true in a way it's never been before. And places like Slate and these other news sites are hiring these people. I mean, we have a ton of people, not just from Columbia J School, but from Northwestern and Missouri. I think the students graduating from the top journalism schools are finding not only work, but kind of work that looks like it may lead to an ongoing career, with the stipulation that you're not going to be working for one organization, that you are going to have to be entrepreneurial in the way I was talking about. So the question arises, what's going on here? Is this a bubble? Is this just a rational economic activity, or is it a bubble in which the valuations bear no relation to reality, and it's going to pop at some point? Bubbles are very hard to see, especially when you're in one. After it's over, everyone sees it. When you're in one, very few people are willing to are able to accurately diagnose it. But I think there are certainly some bubble-like characteristics, and there are actually some dangers to serious journalism that come from this kind of frothy, exuberant environment. One of them is that because it's very fad-driven, trend-driven, advertising dollars are going to go to these new buzzy sites that don't actually have to make money to survive because they have so much capital coming in and they're not really looking to profitability. Another danger is that you have this expandable supply of digital content, right? But the advertising budgets aren't overall going up. So what that does is it drives advertising prices down. The term of art in our profession is called CPM, which stands for cost per million, but it's essentially what you're paying to purchase 1,000 views. And there's been in the business overall very little pricing pressure on CPMs, and in some cases they're going down very dramatically. And then another risk is that that the kind of all this capital going into the field drives up the cost of editorial talent without there being any new revenues to go with it, right? And that's good news for all of you who are graduating, who are going to be subject to bidding wars. But if you're me and you have to think about how to make the business work, having to pay more and more for the editorial talent is actually not an unmitigated good, although I'm very happy for all of you. So I think there are actually two distinct views of what's going on. And one's very positive and one's very negative. There was a really good version of the positive one last week that Felix Salmon wrote in Politico magazine. Politico magazine is actually another great digital startup, just happened in the last year. It's a digital web magazine spun out of Politico, the daily news service. And what Felix Salmon argued, he was talking specifically about these wonk sites, data journalism. Nate Silver, Ezra Klein, David Leonhardt, who's a terrific journalist in the New York Times, who's starting a version at the Times to kind of replace 538 that Nate Silver took with him. And Felix Salmon said, this isn't a bubble at all. It actually works. And he said, first of all, these sites and these journalists they're very non-ideological. They write very serious kind of policy content, but they make it fun and they make it interesting. And advertisers love to be around this content because it's sort of substantive, but there's no kind of political point of view. And he thinks advertisers pay very high CPMs, and on that basis it'll work. And he also talks about it as a cluster, right? If you had, and he compared it to the Diamond District on 47th Street. If you had one diamond store, it probably wouldn't make it there. But if you have 30 of them, it creates the supply creates its own demand. Or having two Starbucks across the street from each other when previously there were none. Suddenly people are spending money on coffee. And it's a sort of self-sustaining fad that way. The pessimistic view I've seen expressed most clearly by Michael Wolff, who writes a column for USA Today. He also writes for The Guardian. And he thinks we're just living in this period of chronic oversupply of digital content. However cheaply you can create it, the CPMs are going to keep falling, and they won't support doing the journalism. He thinks it's kind of race to the bottom, in which sort of more and more traffic becomes less and less valuable. And the Huffington Post might be a good example of what he's talking about. It's now the biggest news site in the United States. It doesn't pay most of its contributors anything, and it's actually a lousy business, right? I mean, most people think the Huffington Post is very successful because it sold for all this money to AOL. It never made money, and it loses money now, right? So you're paying your authors nothing, you're huge, and you're losing money. That's a kind of bad outcome. Where do I come out? I'm sort of in between. I think I'm closer to the Felix Salmon view. I think we're in this moment when publications and innovative journalists are inventing all these new modes of journalism, and that's just a great thing in itself, and it's not all of it is going to be sustainable, but I think there's reason to think that a lot of it will be, and it's sort of an exciting time. I also think there is a very kind of frothy, junky side to what's going on. There are sites that are just about generating cheap traffic, that aren't building content. Forbes is the site that always springs to mind since we're naming names here. They're playing this kind of hot potato game where you're trying to get huge and then get someone to buy you before they sort of look too closely under the hood and see that you don't actually have an audience. You've just generated a lot of clickbait. And I was particularly outraged on Forbes is also sort of notorious for blurring the line between the editorial content and the advertising. I went to the homepage a while ago just out of curiosity to look at it. And the top story they were featuring was a comparison of climate science to Nazi science. And you looked at the bottom of it, and it was written by someone in the oil and gas industry. And it was a piece of advertising, but there was absolutely no way to tell that it was, you can't distinguish between the advertising, the unpaid contributors, or the contributors who are only paid based on traffic, and the actual Forbes journalists. Anyway, I think that's that's a dead-end game. But on the side of optimism, right, a lot of people are rushing into this profession now and pumping money into it. And it's certainly a lot better than everybody rushing out of it, which is what seemed to be happening not that long ago. And I think the better of these sites are going to find niches too, just like these sort of high-quality legacy sites have. I want to talk about Slate for a few minutes before we open it up to questions. Slate has a funny in-between role. We're sort of, to new media, we're old media, and to old media, we're new media. The way we're most like a startup is the centrality we accord to technology, which we have really made equal to in status and integrated as much as we can with our editorial and business teams. And that's something you don't see at more traditional publications. About 10 years ago, when we were still at Microsoft, I sort of developed the view that we had the wrong kind of ownership. Microsoft was very good to us, but they were never comfortable in the media business, and they were also so huge relative to us that it was hard to sort of convince anyone there of the importance of us being profitable. Their attitude was sort of, don't worry about being profitable. If you lose $1 million a year, we can, that's a rounding error to us. But I didn't think that was a good long-term plan for us, which is why we ended up being sold and acquired by the Washington Post company, which is now called Graham Holdings Company since we sold the Washington Post. But we thought that would be a much better place for us, and it has been. In the 9 years we've been there, we've seen heavy expansion in our traffic, our revenue, or just how self-sufficient we are overall. And in the scope of our editorial ambitions. I mean, Slate now takes on projects that, journalists spending 5 weeks doing an in-depth multimedia type investigation or pursuit of a story that, we didn't, in the old days, we didn't think were really possible. And I think, we've demonstrated something that I'm not sure some of the younger techie sites have done, which is that this high-quality content can work as a business. Slate's profitable now, and that has been a very, very big deal to us, getting to that point. We have a staff of about 90 people. We use mostly paid staff journalists who get benefits, unlike at some magazines I could name where staff writers don't get health insurance. At Slate, everybody gets health insurance. We do have some regular freelancers on top of that. And we pay our interns. That's a big deal too. So we don't just get kind of kids of privilege who are subsidized by someone else to work for us. And interns are very, very important to us because in the digital world we're in, they relate to parts of it and understand parts of it in a way that people even a lot younger than I am just are not likely to get. Working at Slate, I think, I'm just sure Will vouch for me here, but I mean, it supports if you're a journalist at Slate, you can have a middle-class income. You can live in Brooklyn, or you could live in Brooklyn before the Brooklyn bubble. Now you can live somewhere. You can live in Astoria. Yeah, you can live in Astoria for maybe a little longer. But the question arises, how can a kind of mature site like ours that pays its journalists a living wage, that does real journalism, that invests in content, how can we compete against these new startups that are much more technology-oriented, and that don't have to turn a profit? It sometimes seems really unfair to me that we have to actually make money, and we have these competitors that all they have to do is get bigger, and people will keep giving them money. But I think profitability has been a really valuable discipline for us, and it's kept us focused on this sort of larger problem of how, as a society, are we going to pay for the kind of high-quality journalism that we need as a check on democracy, as a check on government, among other things, in a democratic society. And Slate, when you look at it, has some advantages of its own. We have this strong, distinct identity. We have a culture that really lets sort of individual writers shine and develop their reputation. We have an ownership structure that supports our journalistic values. Our head of technology has a very nice way of putting this. He says Slate has an editorial culture that's adapted to the needs of our business without being subsumed by the business. When I look at these news sites, I don't see that everywhere, right? I mean, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, they're actually investing in real journalism. There's no question about it. They're putting real resources into it. But I don't think it is in their DNA. The question is, are you looking to Vice or to BuzzFeed for coverage of Syria, for coverage of really, really important international issues? Maybe it's just my generational bias on my part, but I'm not. And I think for these sites, I don't get the feeling that journalism is the ultimate value and purpose of what they do, the way it is for us or the way it is for the New York Times or any of the other news organizations I was mentioning in that group. I don't think the owners of those businesses are likely to value independent journalism the way the Graham family, which still owns Slate, has always done. And I don't necessarily have the same confidence in their editorial integrity when it comes into conflict from the venture capitalists who've put the money in and are going to be looking for a 20x exit at some point. Also, these places, I'm sounding probably more critical than I want to be here because I admire all of these places and people a great deal, but they also have the disadvantage of being cults of personality, right? There's no Huffington Post without Arianna Huffington. There's no BuzzFeed without Jonah Peretti. There's no Gawker without Nick Denton. There's no Business Insider without Henry Blodgett. There very much would still be a Slate without me or without David Plotz, the editor. But these places have been very good for us. The competition from people who think in a newer way, who are closer to the emergence of social media, has been a benefit. I mean, we've been able to, I think, learn from a lot of that disruptive innovation without being fundamentally disrupted ourselves. And I think, a big change at Slate in recent years that's really been prompted by these newer sites is that we've developed this culture around data, analytics, and testing, which is much more characteristic of a technology company, of this sort of Silicon Valley view of the world. And you see that reflected in this amazing traffic growth which Slate has had. Slate's now growing faster than it has really since we started it 17 years ago. In March, we hit another record. We had 31+ million unique users, which is a figure we look very closely at. That's the number of different browsers that come to the site in the course of a month. That's almost double what we were in September, 6 months before. It's incredible. It's kind of startup world growth. And there are specific drivers of that. Facebook has played a big part. They've changed their algorithms to give more prominence to original editorial content, to news. Thank you, Facebook. We're very appreciative of that. Everybody's benefited from that, or that is, most news sites have. But we've benefited really disproportionately because of the way we have integrated technology and thought about technology as a site. Most of the growth is on mobile, and it's having redesigned our site in a way that the reading experience on mobile is high quality, using responsive design, and the sharing on mobile really works. And you sort of had to do that to position yourself to benefit from what Facebook did. It is interesting, just a side note, all the growth is on mobile for everybody, right? I mean, where Slate is still growing its desktop audience slowly, most sites are seeing a shrinking desktop audience. It's actually people moving from desktop to mobile. And there's a big business challenge there too. Now this has surprised the hell out of me, by the way. I did not think people would be reading longer form content on phones. I'm not even talking about tablets. I'm talking about handset mobile phones. People now will read everything on their phones, and I will too. And that wasn't true a year ago, and I didn't think it was going to be true. And so, there are ways in which if you're operating too much on the basis of assumptions like that, as opposed to watching where the data is and watching what your readers are actually doing and reacting to it, you're not going to be in as good a position. The risk, and I'll wind up here in just a second, but the risk, around mobile that people worry about is very similar to this switch from print to digital, right? The CPMs, the advertising prices, are currently much lower. And if all of the CPMs we got were network CPMs on phones, we wouldn't have enough revenue to support the site. My bet is that CPMs on mobile are going to go up a lot, because I think if you look at it objectively, an ad seen on a phone is not worse than an ad seen on the desktop. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's a lot better than an ad seen on a desktop, because it occupies the whole screen, the whole of your attention for some period of time. And I think what we're already seeing on Slate, and a lot of people in the industry are pushing with good reason, is for an advertising view to be an advertising view. If you're an advertiser, you should want to reach the audience of the publication where you're advertising across all of the platforms where they're interacting with the content. Maybe desktop during the day at work, but then it's on their phones in the evening, and maybe their tablets on the weekend, whatever. But there's no reason why you would pay 8 times, no rational reason to pay 8 times as much for the desktop as the other. Our business model remains a work in progress. I'll give a little pitch here at the end. We want to replicate what is the traditional strength of the media business in having multiple revenue streams, right? And right now we're too dependent on advertising. It's worked well for us. It supports what we do, but we want to figure out how to get some money from our readers, and we want to do it. And this is the hard part, without having a paywall, because, like I said, we had a paywall in 1998. We didn't like it because it cuts off the audience. Right, and we really, really like that big audience. We love that 31 million number. We want it to get even bigger. So the question is, how can we get some money from our readers to diversify our revenue stream and make us healthier and less dependent on advertising without restricting the content? And what we've come up with, and we're launching next week, is something called Slate Plus. It's a membership program. And it is, in one sense, like an NPR model. We're saying, support the journalism we do. It's free. You don't have to pay for it. But if you're a consumer of it, it's a good thing. You should want it to succeed, and you should pitch in and help. And you get a tote bag. Actually, you don't get a tote bag. We had Jonathan Adler design a mug for us, which is way better than a tote bag. But it's also like Amazon Prime in that we're sort of saying, here, our best customers, we're going to have a section of the site for you. We're going to have people who are just working on that, and we're going to be thinking all the time about what we can do to delight and amuse you, to make you happier, to really, you're the audience we care the most about, and we're not going to, the stuff that's free now is going to stay free, but we're going to give you behind the scenes stuff, we're going to give you access to our events, we're going to give you all sorts of opportunities to interact with our personalities and writers. They're going to see your little badged comments. They're going to respond directly to you. All of that stuff, which we think is going to be appealing. Actually, interestingly, the New York Times just launched a version of this, right? In Times Premiere. It's a lot more expensive than ours, $10 a month. Ours is only $5 a month. But it's similarly based on kind of like be even closer to us, similar kind of core idea. The goal, is for us to be around for the next 17 years, and on from there. And the trick is to think like a startup while building an institution. And with that, I'd be very happy
Great.
to sit down and take some questions.
Sit
Thank you.
down. Let me start by asking a couple of questions, but this is really for you, so you should line up at that microphone and take advantage of Jacob's presence. Jacob, is it a fool's errand to try to think of a model if one wants to start a new Slate or a new website online, as opposed to your observation that everyone has happened in a different way? If I were putting together a kit of how you do it, how much money would it cost?
Well, you can do it for nothing if it's just you. And,
Okay.
and it's your hobby, and you don't need to get paid for whatever reason. And that's that's the beauty of it, right? People could create sites and start attracting audiences. And then when you attract an audience, you have something that has value. Either it has value to a larger site that wants to take you in and get your traffic, or you can very simply sell advertising yourself through networks without having a sales force,
Right.
or you can develop something else. This is what Andrew Sullivan's ultimately done, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Let me ask two more questions. Maybe you can't answer or won't answer or shouldn't answer. It took you 17 years to start making money. How much money was spent over those 7 years? How much was invested to get to the break-even point?
Yeah, I haven't done the calculation. I mean, I'm happy to be, pretty open about it. Like, I can't give out a lot of specifics about our actual numbers now.
Right.
But it was the good news, if you look back on that, is that Slate's been pretty close to break even for a lot of that time. We've actually touched it a few times in the past. It's only now that we're really you factor everything in,
Right.
And there also were things like, there's a difference between, say, what it costs the Washington Post company to put out Slate as an incremental cost, and how much you now figure our costs with overhead,
Right.
and so on. I would say if you did the total calculation over 16 years, it's in the tens of millions of dollars, but it's certainly not $100 million. It's
Right.
much less than that. But whatever our value is, when you're a profitable business and you have a big audience,
Right.
that money hasn't been lost. That money is reflected in the value of the property.
All right. One last question from me. The Nation magazine has basically done what you're talking about in print, but not online. It has a group called Nation Associates. We don't charge them $5 or $10 a year, but we ask them to send what they can. In exchange for that, they get a newsletter telling them what's happened behind the scenes. They get invited to events around the country. They get a series of opportunities to buy books at a discount. So this has been done before, but
Yeah.
usually in enterprises who are not primarily in the money-making business.
Yeah.
They've been done by cause enterprises. So what you're telling us, if I hear you right, is that Slate, for its viewers, is a cause as well as a product.
Yeah, it's not a cause like the Nation is. It's not because of a political or ideological affiliation. Not that that's all the Nation is, but I think you have that
Right.
driving it. I mean, it's interesting in this world of all these hybrids and complicated models. NPR is not for profit, but carries advertising, which they call sponsorship. Slate is for profit, but is going to have members supporting it. They're going to get benefits very much like the one public radio gets. You sort of can get. National Geographic is a not-for-profit, but makes a ton of money. It's sort of like you can get a little hung up on the definitional thing. I think to me the key point is that the more revenue streams you have, the healthier you are. Because a lot of bad things come with being too dependent on advertising. There can be pressures. There can be the evanescence and mercurial nature of the advertising business. And I think actually NPR is incredibly healthy right now because they have so many different revenue streams. They have money from advertising. They have money from their members. They actually have some money from the government through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. You sort of put all that together, and NPR has had disastrously bad management, right? I mean, they've been through like more CEOs in the last decade than any other company you can think of. It hasn't mattered. It's actually financially been pretty healthy. They've had big charitable donations. I mean, and sort of the more streams you can get coming in, the more you are going to be in a position to do what you want journalistically.
Great. Very inspiring on one level, especially if you have $10 million to get there, like Gates did. So why don't you join in the conversation and say who you are?
Yes.
And
Yeah, hi. I'm Sameepa. I graduated last year, and personally I'm very interested in the business of media, so thank you. This has been very insightful so far. I work for a global news organization, and I actually had a three-part question for you, if you would indulge me.
I might need to write it down. So yeah.
They're pretty straightforward. The first thing is, when you talked about Slate Plus, what research, what study, or what made you think that people would want to subscribe and be a part of that? So what kind of background work was done before that decision? And the second part is, how concerned are you about the changing privacy policies, web attribution when it comes to advertising, and all of that will have a material impact on advertising revenues, which you said you're so heavily dependent on right now.
Yeah.
And the final part of my question is, have you thought about geographic paywalls? Because having been around the world and sort of getting an idea of readers, there is still this allure of American brands, and geographical paywalls might be something that could be successfully used.
Great. Those are three really good questions. I would dispute that it's a three-part question. It's actually three different questions, but I'm very happy to answer them all. In terms of how we modeled Slate Plus, I've been really excited with the way we've gone at it. First of all, we did a lot of research, asking our readers through intercept surveys and so on what they would want, and trying a lot of alternatives. Did they want to go on a cruise like they do for The Nation? Did they want interaction with our writers? Did they want us to do more events? Did they want badges when they commented? And we've really looked at that data, and it's not that the offering exactly reflects the maximum number of votes for these different things, but we really tried to listen to what we thought people would respond to. And I was a little surprised, to be honest, that there was so much interest in the kind of interaction with the personalities. Slate is not traditionally a super personality-driven publication, but that seemed to be, I think we've really put that at the center of it because I think it's what users wanted. But we've really gone at the rollout of it in this very, very analytical way. So we've segmented our audience. We've looked at the parts of our audience that we think are most likely to want to sign up for this. And that includes a segment of our audience we call 25 times a month, people who come to Slate 25 times or more a month. So they're like people who come every day. Our podcast listeners, podcasting has turned into a huge deal at Slate, and it turns out to develop this extremely kind of strong bond, which I think is based on the sort of intimacy of the human voice, with the people who do these podcasters, and they turn out for our events and so on. So that's a kind of core segment for us. People who come to our homepage, as opposed to people who follow links through social media or search. And we've got these segments, and then we're testing the different offers against these segments. So does the segment respond more to the offer of the mug from Jonathan Adler, or to the picture of the political gabfest sitting around the microphone? And this is what goes on in the tech world, right? You see these incremental differences in performance, and you can use that to drive better results. So we're going at it in a very, very analytical way. I think even more analytical in the way we're trying to implement it than in the way we've modeled it originally. Question 2, I remember question 3. Wait, what's question 2?
Are you concerned about the changing privacy and security policies around the world?
Oh,
Web attribution for advertising, disabling cookies.
Right. Yeah. So the big issue is around third-party cookies, whether advertisers these ad networks can essentially apply cookies to extract information, which they use to target advertising. If they actually this has been a bill before Congress, and there's some movement to sort of restrict that. If it were restricted, it would actually be great for us because we can gather data directly on our users, right, through our user agreement. And if you can't do targeting through networks and third-party cookies, it would actually be very good news for publishers that are able to gather some data with permission directly. However, I don't think that's at all likely to happen. I mean, I think the lobbies around this for the sort of big tech is very likely to, for reasons you're very familiar with, having to do with campaign finance and political influence. It's very, very unlikely. It's unlikely that any restriction will happen. Reserving the question of what should happen, I think we're sort of fine either way. I mean, we're a very small, barnacle on the very big fish here. And the last question about international paywalls, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's sort of, we're not theologically opposed to paywalls. We just kind of resist them. We only want to do them if we have to. We don't want anybody who wants to read Slate to not be able to read it if we don't have to charge them. Although we do want to have a really good business. But if there are people in, the developing world countries that want to read Slate, I mean, that, I sort of hate the idea that the people who kind of will be least able to pay for it are the ones who are going to hit some kind of a paywall. On the other hand, we're not able to monetize those audiences at all, right? Because the advertising against international audiences has almost no value. So it does seem fair to say we're asking you as a reader in Europe to pay because we're not making any money from selling advertising against you reading it. So it's something we might do down the road. I don't think it would be a game changer for us, but it's come up. Yeah.
Good.
Who else has a three-part question or a four-part question?
Hi, I'm Aaliyah. I'm a freelance journalist and a global journalism fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Thanks so much for your talk. It was really interesting to hear your comments on kind of the different models that are out there right now. And I was wondering what you think kind of these new models mean for the profession of journalism on like a day-to-day basis. Like, how is the work of journalists changing because of these business models? And also, to what extent do you think media outlets are going to have to rely on freelancers to supply content if they perhaps can't afford to have as many staff reporters? And what that kind of means for the business models?
Yeah. Well, sort of as I was saying, I don't think there is one, I think there are places that rely more on freelancers, including the ones that are relying on unpaid freelancers. But at the other end of the profession, you're seeing top journalists, including very young journalists, getting paid amounts that exceed what, anybody has been paid, any reporters at the New York Times have been paid for a long time. Now, that's particularly in certain specialties like technology, business. It's driven by that may or may not be sort of ultimately sustainable. So, but you kind of have, like in a lot of other aspects of society, you have greater inequality, right? I mean, you have people at the top doing better than ever, and you have people at the bottom doing worse than ever. In terms of what it does to journalism overall, I think it has a lot of consequences. I mean, I think the big change to journalism from the web comes from the storytelling opportunity, the ways you can use multimedia, the kind of flexibility, the tone, the ability to be idiosyncratic, to the sort of world of the sort of formal diction of traditional newspaper journalism. A version of that still exists, in few pockets, but in other places, people have been able to invent these new forms. Now, the economic pressures have meant certain things on top of that. High premium placed on speed, on productivity. Until pretty recently, our operating assumption at Slate was that the big driver of our traffic growth was quantity of publication. And so somebody who could really, produce like a Banshee was really, really highly valued. And there tended to be a generational component to that, right? I mean, journalists in their 20s were comfortable with the idea you were going to post something 6, 8, in the case of Matt Iglesias, who worked at Slate until recently, 12, 15 times a day. If you were go to journalists at the Washington Post and suggest that, they would think you were absolutely insane. I mean, they think once a day is much too much, and so that's an economic pressure, but I don't think it's necessarily a pressure for the worse. It's different. But at the same time, even the journalists who write frequently do have ambitions in terms of going deeper, taking longer to do certain things. So you may have this daily output that's much more frequent than the old daily kind of running story of journalism. But at the same time, you're taking regular breaks to go much more deeply into something, to write short books, to produce in different forms and different scales.
Good.
Hello, I'm Vicki Pasquantonio. You said something interesting about you were in the editorial side before you started on the business track, and I was wondering if you could talk more about that transition, if there were specific influences. I sort of say this on a bit of a personal note. I'm English teacher turned journalism student here, still teaching in the part-time program, and it's a very interesting discussion to have here. It just does not come natural to my thinking or my being to think like an entrepreneur, and I know how important that is. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it didn't come very naturally to me. I mean, I never thought I would be, in a business role anywhere. I mean, I grew up with all of the normal prejudices for a, liberal household and someone who studied the humanities. I thought people on the business side were probably, not as interesting and not as creative, and all they did was sort of make money, and the creative people were all doing sort of content. And that just turns out not to be true, right? Because these business challenges are incredibly hard, and people who are creative about business are, every bit as creative as people who are creative as journalists. It's just they're different in all sorts of ways. But I never decided, I mean, I've never made a lot of career decisions, period. I've always just done the kind of next interesting thing in front of me. But, it's sort of at some point I was really drawn into that. And I, looking back on it, I was always really interested in that. I mean, I kind of have a commercial instinct. I was always sort of interested in this problem. I was never sort of okay with sort of someone else is dealing with this, right? I always felt it was like a problem to be solved. And the fact that it's a hard problem makes it interesting. Someone told me, I was talking to someone about tech people, developers, and why it's very hard to get, sort of top-level developers to work at media sites, journalism sites. And I said, well, isn't it because they don't pay competitively with, tech companies? The person I was talking to said, no, that's not it at all. It's that for developers, content sites are too easy. And really good developers like to work on really hard problems. And if you don't give them, you have to figure out some way to make the hard problem much harder for them, or you're not going to be able to attract them. They're actually much less motivated by money than you think. And in fact, a lot of the salaries in media sites for people on the tech side are competitive. And that's kind of like really resonated with me, but partly because I feel like I respond to the same thing, I love doing journalism. I don't feel I'm done doing it. I intend to go back to it. But at the moment, this is the kind of hard challenge that I respond to. Betsy.
Hi. Hi, I'm Betsy West, and I teach here at the Journalism School, and I teach video journalism. And we had a brief conversation about video online. It does seem that it's become the rage, that everybody is doing video, and many newspapers really want their reporters to be able to shoot and are developing larger sites for video, and yet we know that it really doesn't sustain that kind of advertising revenue. What's your thought about what works for video and where this is heading now?
Yeah. In terms of what works sort of editorially for users, I think web video, it has to be created for the web. It has to have, the successful web video has some distinct properties. It's generally short, can be really short, as short as 30 seconds. Anything that's as long as 4 minutes has a lot of cards stacked against it. It has to have humor. Doesn't mean it has to be comedy, but using humor is, kind of gives it that potential for spreading, for viral spread. And it has to be, I think it is even more viral in nature than non-video content. That is because nobody generating a huge amount of video traffic on their own sites. I mean, the networks, a certain amount for news. But other than YouTube, right? If you're any other kind of website, you're depending for video on people following viral links, and so you have to think about what about a video is going to cause it to spread in a contagious way, and usually that is some kind of pithy thing that it adds or does, or a way that it's expressed or broken down. It really has to add. It has to have value in a very particular way, because it's not a form of overall regular consumption of news. And it can be an imposition, right? It's generally a pretty bad experience when you watch it on websites. I mean, those pre-roll ads are terrible. Nobody likes them. You don't want to watch a 30-second ad before you watch a 60-second video. It's sort of not a good experience. And sites, it's one of these trends that media sites really kind of piled into without having necessarily a theory of the case, either in terms of how you created differentiated content that was valuable or what the business was. I mean, I think a lot of sites started creating video, invested a lot of money into it, and looked around and said, yeah, the CPMs are high, but there's so few views that there's no way you can support the cost of making the video. Now, for a site like Slate, we like making video because we feel like we have a specific tone and approach, and we do things, and we think certain things we do are best done in video. The business defense is not that we make money on every video, but rather that having that capacity helps you sell big advertising programs that have video as a component. But weirdly, I think podcasting is a fundamentally much better business. It's a much better advertising model. You have the host reads, which is the model of old-time radio, where the broadcasters doing the show stop and talk about the sponsor for a minute, which you don't allow the equivalent in video or in print, but that's how it's always worked on radio, so it's sort of okay in podcasting. You have very high CPMs, you have this the most intense engagement with audiences, and the cost of productions are much lower than video because you don't need all the video equipment. But go figure, people are still pumping a ton of money into video and very little, other than us, into podcasting.
Jake, I have a related question, which has to do with words rather than video, but is there a literature on length? Is there an expectation on length? Is there evidence about how long pieces can be and still work? I'm involved with a workshop that is right now putting out an online magazine, and we just started saying feature pieces should aim to be 2,000 words or less. And people have come in with 4,000 word pieces. And one of the beauties of the web is that you're not limited the way you are in a print magazine by space. So what is the wisdom about length?
But I mean, yes, you should always aim for shorter. But the length does have a perverse effect, right? You may say you're not limited for space, but if people get the sense that something's very long, they won't invest in it. I mean, I think people have an intuitive sense of how much they're being asked to commit to something.
Right.
But it's changing. It's changed, and it's changing all the time. I mean, for a long time in Slate, we said no one is going to read anything on a computer screen sitting up longer than 1,000 words. It's unreasonable demand to place on people. And we had a pretty arbitrary limit, and we very seldom did things longer than that. We loved doing things shorter than that. Then when mobile started, we said, God, people aren't going to read things that are 1,000 words. On mobile, on phones, things probably have to be 200 words, right? But then all of a sudden, we started doing these much longer projects on Slate, and other people started doing long-form things, and long-form and the Atavist and all these sites, and people started very happily reading these very long things on their desktop, and then they started reading them on their phones. So I don't think there's any rule of thumb that you could put much confidence in. I mean, I think there are people who will now read War and Peace on their iPhones. On the other hand, You never get in trouble by making something too short. Things should be no longer than they need to be, and you should aim for things to be concise, and part of the value you create is by being massively efficient. I think people demand efficiency, but some, for certain kinds of stories, the premium is not on getting it a few words down. It's about telling it in a compelling, immersive way.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Thank
So
you.
that's a total non-answer to that question.
Good,
but,
no,
yeah.
it's a helpful
Yeah, yeah.
answer, yeah.
My name's Maggie Perez I'm a homepage editor at MSN. And you mentioned that you, for a long time, had a focus on writers pumping out as many posts as they could in a day, maybe like 6 to 8. Have you turned away from that? And if you have, what are you going towards instead? And what's like an average for a writer?
It's a big range. I
produce-
mean, we had some writers who do that, and we like that, and we've hired some people with that in mind. But then we have other writers, Dahlia Lithwick, Emily Bazelon, John Dickerson. A lot of our signature writers write a maximum of once a day, and in some cases only a few times a week, and that works very well because their pieces are tend to be, they have real audiences, and that works. But what I was saying was this assumption that more posts equals more traffic. I sort of didn't finish the point. Turns out not to be right, or not to be true anymore. That drove our traffic growth up to a point. But when I looked at the data more recently, I said our reach has doubled since September. We have twice as many readers in March as we did in September. Same number of posts, right? We somehow figured out how to get way more page views per post. And I think that assumption that more is out the window. On the other hand, you have to have a lot. I mean, if you're publishing any kind of a news site and you want people to come back frequently, there has to be new stuff there when they come back. There doesn't necessarily have to be new stuff there every 30 seconds, but there has to be new stuff, a few times an hour during the week. Since there has to be new material for people to look at. And there is some return to quantity, but I think there is also, right now, the thing driving traffic at a lot of content sites is less quantity than basically Facebook and social referrals.
Can you, just to follow up on that, can you talk a little bit about the secret sauce that maybe led to your increase, this dramatic increase over the 6 months? I mean, what actually did you do to take advantage of the change at Facebook on your mobile site? And what other things did you do to get people to come to you?
So we did a redesign that launched in September of last year, which is actually before these Facebook changes happened. And what that did, it was based on responsive design. And it means that Slate essentially works the same on various platforms. It has the same navigation, and it scales. And what that means, among other things, I mean, one, it means it's just a sort of nice-looking, fluid experience on phones and on mobile platforms. But it also means the site works really well for sharing content. So we really pared it down. And basically, in terms of sharing, we just have Facebook and Twitter and commenting. Those are the buttons, right? So all we want you to do is read the story in this neat format, look at the picture, look at the ad, share it with your friends. Forget Pinterest, forget Tumblr, forget all these other platforms which aren't as important to us, right? And that was the result of testing. And it turned out we did better with fewer buttons, and you test things like the size of the buttons, and we decided not to use the Facebook like, which they were recommending at the time, but instead to have our own meatball. We call them meatballs. They're little round things, representing the Facebook share, and that was all thoroughly tested out. So then and that started to drive both the mobile growth and the sharing that fueled the mobile growth. That coincided, and the reason we did that redesign is we said, hey, wait a minute, it's just this growth happening on mobile. We can't, we're not a desktop site anymore. It has to work really well on this site. But then when Facebook started to institute these changes, we were very well positioned to take advantage of them because sharing Slate on Facebook worked really well. And if you didn't have a site that was designed for that at that point, you missed some of the wave. And some of the stuff is cumulative, right? I mean, you can't necessarily catch up that easily on some of the growth you miss.
Thanks.
Will Remus.
My name's Will Remus. I write for the online magazine Slate. You talked a little bit about one of the changes in the shift to online media is that we can now see what readers are actually reading. You talked a little bit about the need for more quantity online. Has the ability to see what people are reading changed what Slate covers and how it covers it? Obviously, you said that Slate's commitment is to doing great journalism, but are there differences in what Slate writes about now versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago, based on your ability to see what readers are reading?
Great question. Give that young man a job. Will got hired after coming to this event several years ago. There's this split between publications that think knowing about traffic will corrupt them and they have to shield people from this data, and sites that embrace it and think they should, know exactly what's going on, either because they can maximize it or, in our case, so we can make informed decisions about what to do. And I think we're all Slate editors, and me too, are obsessed with this tool, Chartbeat, which is, I think, the best traffic tool anybody's ever used.
I actually have the Chartbeat app on my phone.
I didn't even know there was an app on the phone. I don't need that. That'll be like, I should confine my Chartbeat. But Chartbeat shows you exactly how many people are on every story in real time. And it shows you whether the story is gaining users or losing users. It shows you the trends against the pattern from the previous week, the average over the previous month. I mean, it's an amazing real-time picture into your data. And I think the way we use Chartbeat is to maximize the performance of what we decide to do. Now, occasionally, Chartbeat doesn't tell you what other people are doing, right? Chartbeat just tells you how well what you're doing is. And Chartbeat will give you insights like, the story you have on the homepage is not performing that well. Maybe put something up, but it doesn't tell you don't do that story. Now you may, over time you learn the lessons you learn about traffic. But I think, the overall impact on Slate of being more sort of immersed in this world has been to be much more responsive to the news, to always go with the instinct that if something's happening, we should figure out something interesting to say about it, as opposed to maybe that doesn't matter so much. But it has not pushed us in a kind of tabloid direction, celebrity direction, kind of junky direction. I mean, we write about very pop stuff. There are people at Slate who are really smart about popular culture and embrace it and love it. But they don't write about it in a cynical way. They write about it, they write about Beyonce when they have a really, really smart point that nobody's thought of about Beyonce. And so, I think we have other tools besides Chartbeat that we use to get insight into like what's going on, but I don't think there's anything equivalent that gives you like a competitive picture, which in some ways would be nice to have, but in other ways does maybe pose some greater risk of corruption. If you really see, Huffington Post is really spiking right now. Look at what's on their cover. Should we do that? I mean, I think the advantage we have is we have such a distinct editorial identity. We know what we are. We know what we do. We would like to have as much traffic as we can possibly have for what we do. We don't want to become something else to get more traffic. And that's not necessarily true at a lot of other places where you're just kind of chasing this rabbit all the time. It is amazing the results can be produced by rabbit chasing at some of these sites. I mean, I forget what the one's called. It's a Facebook optimizer that this guy started out of his house, Viral Nova. Which was had traffic. It was one of the top news sites in the country. One guy, I mean, I think he had 2 people helping him. And essentially what he was doing was trying to figure out what the top trending topics on social media were, aggregate and, slight modification stories on them, and just produce this totally crazy clickbait traffic. Part of me sort of admires that, but it's not something Slate's going to either be good at or is going to want to do.
Let me ask one quick question. Does Slate have a politics?
We've never had an editorial line. We've never run unsigned editorials. We've never taken positions as a magazine. on issues. And I think my approach as when I was editor, and I think David Plotz is the editor, is very much that we're really interested in interesting points of view, surprising points of view about issues. Our writers definitely net out left of center.
Right.
I mean, we have a couple conservative writers. We actually just hired a conservative columnist, Rehan Salam, who's really interesting. But we wanted an interesting conservative columnist. They're really hard to find. There's a real premium for interesting conservatives because most of them are not that interesting. But you know, we want like as much of that as we can get because it's unusual.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jimmy So. I'm the editor of Columbia Global Reports here at Columbia. And I was going to ask you, this is not a two-part question, two questions.
Just a question you're not going to ask, and then when you're going to
Right. Because I was going to ask you a question about the content of Slate, but a lot of people have asked this, and you probably answered this in part already. But I wanted to get at what you think, whether the number of posts, the quantity of the production, you know, where I see David Haglund or, you know, Amanda Marcotte or Will posting kind of 100, 200 word pieces on there and multiple times a day, although Will doesn't do that much anymore.
Yeah.
Whether that model is, number one, kind of a way that is journalism being subsumed, as you said earlier, by a business model of, we see this work, we see the quantity of production work, as term, you know, in traffic terms.
Yeah.
And number two, does that distract from longer form articles that, you know, if Matt Iglesias posts 15 posts a day, he might not be able to write his, you know, 3,000 word piece a day, you know, or you know, in the New Yorker sense of kind of Susan Orlean going to Twitter, and then kind of her production on longer form articles kind of dive. I wonder if that model is somewhat close to, getting dangerously close to kind of a BuzzFeed or Huffington Post model, where shorter, quicker aggregated posts is kind of the moneymaker that is financing kind of their longer, you know, BuzzFeed has long form articles that are great, Huffington Post, you know, won Pulitzers, doing kind of big long form projects, but the moneymaker is kind of in those short.
Yeah, I don't think that's true at all for us. I mean, but we've really shied away from, I mean, we do have the Slatest, which is our version of kind of news aggregation, but we've really tried to avoid being anywhere near that commodity news space, because that kind of race to be first with just delivering the news is not one we're going to win, and it's not what we do. We're a magazine. We have to add value. So even in those very short pieces, we're trying to frame things quickly in some analytical way that adds value. But in terms of kind of writing and reading, I think paradoxically, it's sort of the opposite of what you were getting at. Shorter and longer go really well together. It's the middle that falls out, and that's fine. But you know, I don't know if your experience echoes this at all, but for me, reading a lot of short bursts through the day kind of really increases my appetite to read books when I'm not reading. I'm reading stuff on the web all day long. When I come home, I don't want to read Newsweek or Time. I want to read a book or, you know, long pieces in the New Yorker. And similarly for our writers, we have a specific program around this, which we call, our joking name for it is the Fresca Fellowship. It's essentially something David Plotz started. He drinks Fresca, which is why it's called that. But Fresca does not sponsor it, unfortunately. Every journalist at Slate is supposed to, every year, take a 5-week hiatus to work on a long-form project. And these long-form projects are among the most commercially successful things we do. First of all, they perform really well. You know, the way they get promoted and shared in general, they're not all the same, but the ones that have been the most successful have been the most successful things we've done editorially in terms of traffic. And they're very sponsor friendly because sponsors like these big showcase things. You know, if you tell the companies, this is our best journalism, that's usually what they want. And so it can be really complementary with the sort of nibbles all the time, and then you get a real, you know, 5-course meal. But, you know, what you don't necessarily do is the daily grind of the 800-word piece.
This has been great, and it's a 6-course meal, and we really thank you for this, so very
Thank you,
much.
Victor.
Great.
Thank you all. Thanks.
And those of you who are interested in having a free dinner and hearing the fact-checking editor of the New Yorker, sign up back there. So anyway, how long, by the way, is long form of those pieces you were talking about?
I mean, we've had ones will go at 20,000 words, but
Wow.
I mean, 5, 6, 8. I
Good.
mean, like a long,
Right.
long New
Right.
Yorker story.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is terrific.
Yeah. Thanks. Sure. We'll come around.
Hi.